Lebanon has always had a problem with its neighbors. It is the smallest country in a very volatile region, surrounded by nations who can all still remember when its people belonged to them. So it shouldn't come as a huge surprise to find that when this nation did finally collapse into that long-feared civil war, it did so primarily because of those neighbors. With an expansionist Israel rising out of the Palestinian civil war, hundreds of thousands of terrified humans fled into the surrounding nations. Muslims, Christians, Jews alike, many, if not most, arriving virtually destitute in their newfound homes. In Lebanon, this tragedy was represented by waves of Palestinians who by the early 1970s would represent around a tenth of the population. And whether they were being given passports or not, that was a demographic shift that everyone in the country could constantly feel. For a Lebanese government already teetering on the edge of collapse, it was nothing less than a full-blown crisis. In the eyes of the Syrian government, however, it was kind of a gift. To them, neither Lebanon nor Palestine were anything more than breakaway regions waiting to come back to the greater Syrian fold. The best thing that could possibly happen for them was that the Maronites swallow these Palestinians, choke on them, and then die. And then when their corpses were both writhing on the ground, Syria could just step in and eat them. Two birds, zero stones. Granted, it was a plan originally designed for Jordan, and a plan that had failed quite spectacularly at that, but when all you really want is a medal, silver's just another color of gold. And so in 1971, those now veteran soldiers of the Palestinian Liberation Organization were given the green light to cross Syria's deserts and take formal control of the refugee camps that now spanned the length of Lebanon. Even in the best of times, this would have been a very dark omen, and frankly, these were not the best of times. By the 1970s, Lebanon wasn't just dying, it was dying for a revolution, and you can't really pin that one on Syria. The problem was quite simple, actually. The French had given the Lebanese a government where power was split 55-45 between the Christians and the Muslims, and then instilled a perpetually Christian president that had near authoritarian control. What's worse, they'd claimed that it was a reflection of the national demographics, something even at the time they would have known wasn't true. It was like a time bomb built into the very heart of the nation, forever ticking towards that civil violence it all but made inevitable. And by 1970, that clock had been blinking zero for well over a decade. Even if you'd believed in 1930 whatever that the numbers made sense, by 1970 you knew they were impossible. With Maronite emigration at a generational high, by anybody's guess, it was more like 40, 60. And so 30 years after independence, and the government still hadn't taken a single census, they knew what it would prove. And what did that really mean to the Muslims of the country, if not second-class status? This was taxation without representation. However, that said, I should be careful not to frame this as a purely religious issue just because that's how they split their government, because being Druze or Greek or Armenian, it doesn't come with some natural unity attached to it. The Orthodox religion doesn't make you communist any more than being Maronite makes you right-wing. Every nation speaks in 1,000 voices. The problem killing Lebanon was how few of them were being heard. And so from the hills rose the songs to fill the gaps that the government couldn't, each calling out like a siren towards its own personal rock. To those Greek communists who wanted an independent Lebanon, there was a song for you. To the Nazarite who wanted to unite with Egypt, there was a song for you too. And to those multitude of Maronites who just wanted to crush the PLO, there were so many songs for you. And soon enough, all those songs turned to chants, and those chants into marches, every corner of the country blossoming its own little flag and band of marauders, glorified gangs fighting over the scraps of the national corpse. On the one side were the Christians and the hard-right nationalists, their rulers like neo-feudal lords, ranging from street gangs to full-blown paramilitaries. Together, they operated either as part of or rival to the umbrella organization known as the Lebanese Forces. Names like the AFL, DKK, the Kataeb, MDJ, GZ, MKG, Al Tanzim, Tigers, Guardians of the Cedar, Marada Brigade. Many would call them fascists, which I'd argue is both true and also an oversimplification, but in the most basic terms possible, what they wanted was a strong, independent, Christian ruled Lebanon. But not just any Christians, them. And in response grew the coalition of the Lebanese National Movement, headed by popular Druze politician Kamal Jumblat. Though he himself was a socialist who mainly represented the interests of his own ethnicity, by being a leftist leader of the pro-Palestinian Druze, he was the natural center for any wide-scale rebellion, and without any question, he felt the weight of that position. So where he saw overlap, he saw an ally. Jumblat's umbrella of revolution branched so wide that it could cover virtually anyone who'd agreed to join him. His movement saw hardline Islamic extremists fighting alongside Greek atheists. It contained both the Syrian ultranationalists and the Palestinians they were looking to conquer. Many would go so far as to call them communists, which I'd argue is both true and also an oversimplification. Really, there was no one single worldview here, except that the current world had to change. Which is all to say that the Lebanese civil war wasn't Christian versus Muslim. It wasn't communist versus fascist. It wasn't even Syrian or Israeli or Palestinian or Lebanese. But at the same time, it was all of those things. So as every little corner began yelling with its own little chant, soon all those different lyrics just sort of turned into noise. And it's in that cacophony of revolution where those thousands of battle-hardened, primarily Sunni Palestinian soldiers, fresh off their nearly successful coup of a much stronger nation, entered Lebanon quite literally carrying their weapons in their hands. There wasn't much the Lebanese government could do, really. Just 2 years before, under immense pressure from the other Arab states, the president had already handed away large sections of the country to the PLO. The Palestinian camps were not only able to govern themselves, but the entire southern region of Lebanon was sort of treated as de facto autonomous. Whether the average Lebanese agreed to it or not, their country would be legally designated the headquarters from which Palestinians could continue their struggle against Israel, and therefore also the shooting grounds for when those Israeli tanks came to kill them for it. So as you might imagine, not everyone was too happy about that. A literal army had marched into their country unopposed and been handed the administration of hundreds of thousands of desperate people. People who had far more in common with those revolutionaries than they did with those in power. And Marines might have put down the rebellion of the 50s, but with Vietnam now spitting them back in boxes, Americans weren't ready for another large-scale war with an entirely new subcontinent. The government was effectively on their own, and the Maronites weren't the only ones who felt that. That said, they did have one ace up their sleeve, at least in their minds. Because according to declassified documents from the CIA, those Maronites had made a secret deal with Syria. In exchange for letting in the PLO, they'd be given assurances. If things with those Palestinians ever went too far, they could trust their friend Hafez al-Assad to send in his army to protect them. All he wanted, he said, was a stable Lebanon. And it was under those assurances that in 1975, two events would rock this country into war. The first came in February, when the same right-wing Christian ex-president who'd inspired the revolution of the 50s tried to monopolize the historically unionized fishing industry off the coast of the predominantly Muslim city of Sidon. When they protested, someone shot one of their most popular leaders dead in the street, a man who represented not just the Sunni religion, but also the politics of Nasserism, a pan-Arab Muslim socialist. It was as if his murder was purpose-built to offend every single powerful faction in the nation. In the riots that followed, Jumblat's coalition, the Islamic radicals, and Palestinian militias would all fight side by side for the very first time. They'd even die together. And that would matter a great deal a month later when the real violence violence began. On April 13, 1975, Pierre Ismail, then leader of the powerful Kateb militia, was attacked in a drive-by shooting by what were supposedly members of the PLO. And even though he wasn't personally hurt, a man was murdered, and a response was all but guaranteed. They might not have ID'd the shooters, but trust they'd find somebody to stand for this. And as they searched the country for someone to murder, a bus full of Palestinians just so happened to be returning from an anti-Israeli political rally. It was a route that took them right through the heart of Christian Lebanon. And turning down that narrow alley that would forever bear their memories, militiamen jumped out from the walls and riddled their bus with bullets. 27 dead, 19 wounded. They'd call it revenge. But I doubt anyone on that bus would agree. 3 days later, and the death toll was over 300 by October, thousands. The nation was fully divided. The government had completely lost control. They call this the first stage of the Lebanese Civil War, although internationally I'd argue it's best remembered as the Battle of the Hotels. I suppose in the modern day it might be hard to imagine, but right before they shot that bus, this strip between the St. George on the Water and the Holiday Inn a few hundred meters up would have been one of the most desirable tourist destinations on the planet. And now they were a killing grounds. Videos of the Beirut Holiday Inn on fire are some of the most important images captured in the 1970s. They fundamentally changed the international perception of Lebanon as a nation. No longer was Beirut perceived as a Paris of the Mediterranean, but now just another Palestine to depress the world's news. And then came the massacres. In January of '76, the Lebanese front would murder over 1,000 civilians in a Palestinian-controlled neighborhood of East Beirut. In turn, the coalition would respond by wiping out a Christian village. And by February, the city would be cut in half. Christians in the east and Muslims in the west. Self-derived ghettos meant to keep their ethnicities safe. But nowhere felt safe. It was chaos. There were snipers in residential towers staring in your windows. Roadblocks cutting the country like a knife. Death was a daily occurrence, an hourly occurrence. And that once political revolution quickly started turning into an uncontrollable sectarian killing spree. In short, it was exactly what Syria had hoped for. For their part, the Lebanese government simply had no answer to this violence. To support the Christian militias would destroy the nation politically, but to not support them would effectively give up the country to revolution, and then they'd lose anyway. If they didn't help the Maronites, Christians in the military were going to defect, but if they did help them, Muslims would do the same. And so, somehow, in their infinite wisdom, they found a way to do both. And by March of 1976, professional soldiers had formed their own militias, and the tide of battle started to turn towards that coalition. Jumblatt's power had begun to snowball. It was the government's greatest fear. Nearly 75% of the country now belonged in the hands of these revolutionaries, and the loss of that historic Maronite control seemed all but inevitable. And so, fearing death, that Frankenstein opened the door and invited in a vampire. On June 1st, 1976, the Arab League was asked by those Christians to march nearly 30,000 soldiers into Lebanon, and of course, Syria answered that call. They weren't invading, they were invited. And what's more, they weren't the only ones coming. Seeing that the PLO might actually win and turn Lebanon into a full enemy of Israel, those Maronites found themselves a second powerful ally. What's more, it was someone with all the weapons of the Americans, and more importantly, none of their sensitivities. Overnight, Tel Aviv would flood the Lebanese Christians with weapons, funding, and airstrikes, the holy trinity of war. And with these new friends, it wouldn't even be a week before they'd turned back that tide of revolution. By July, the Lebanese forces were on top again, making territorial gains that they'd failed at since the beginning of the war. Gains that would become victories, that would become massacres. In August, they'd overrun the refugee camp at Tel al-Zatar, where once again those Christian militias would murder over 1,000 innocent Palestinians, pulling boys from their mothers just to shoot them against some wall. 2 months later, and the coalition would exact their revenge on the Kateb village of Shia. But Israeli bombardment would cost them far more than they'd gain. Now, on the back foot, Jumblat's coalition would agree to a ceasefire with the Maronites, but that too was just part of the Damascene plan. All it meant to them was that there wasn't an ethnicity left who wasn't willing to invite them in. And while they might have sent the peacekeepers, they had no interest in maintaining the peace, and as soon as their troops settled into those posts, the Syrians murdered Jumblat. Or, I suppose I should say, allegedly. What's more, they pinned it on the Christians, their own allies, knowing full well that in revenge Drew's militiamen would kill them in the hundreds, because it gave the Syrians not only the opportunity to raise local tensions, but also the ability to control them. A seesaw action meant to decapitate any ethnicity whose leader wasn't theirs to control. Jumblat just happened to be the first. So even with his son as the new leader of the Druze, that coalition that he'd built would die alongside him. The calculus had changed. And plus, any hole that those Syrians found, they'd stuff in money and guns until it became a chasm. And so the first to back out were the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, the Muslim fascists, Lebanese, for whatever reason, who happened to want to be annexed by a powerful, hard-right Syria. They'd originally opposed Assad, but recently they'd come to realize that his regime had secret intentions quite similar to their own, actually, and in Lebanon, they could be the assassins that Damascus required to push that agenda forward. To put it simply, they were Assad's dogs. The PLO would go second, although they'd still fight alongside the Druze in the battles yet to come. Their real enemy was always Israel, and so beyond what they needed to control West Beirut, they'd send the bulk of their armies back to their strongholds in the south. Which not everybody was happy about, of course. Those were historically Shia lands, and as those Sunni numbers swelled against the border, it caused an anger that turned to spite and eventually resistance. From those Shia would rise a new powerful militia called Amal, yet another Syrian proxy to help hold back those PLO. And with that, the war would see its first major realignment, and the second phase had begun. In the north, under this new ceasefire, Bashir Ismail, son of the founder of the anti-Syrian Kateb militia, would take advantage of the relative calm and begin violently uniting the many Christian fiefs. He dreamed of controlling the Maronites the way that Jumblat controlled the Druze, and he called this the unification of the rifle, but it was more like a powerful lord looking to make himself king, perhaps a capo becoming a don. Nothing less than the living embodiment of the far-right Christian dream. It's just that to become it, a lot of Christians were going to have to die. In June of 1978, he'd kill over 40 members of the rival Frangieh clan, then the country's most powerful pro-Syrian Christian political dynasty. He even killed their heir, which to the Syrians occupying this country was nothing less than a declaration of war. And on July 1st, they'd retaliate. Kateb neighborhoods in East Beirut would see thousands of shells dropped on their homes. 15,000 Syrian troops, including an entire brigade of special forces, would be sent to crush those arrogant Christians. But I suppose they weren't that special because they would almost immediately lose. They'd be surrounded in such an embarrassing defeat that Syria would actually be forced to beg the USSR to protect their now tenuous control of Lebanon. They'd even lose a second time trying to siege the city of Zala, all of which would only serve to increase Ismail's power. And now firmly in control, in 1980, he'd commit yet another Christian massacre, wiping out 87 of ex-President Camille Chamoun's Tigers in a single raid. And credit where credit is due, he would unite those rifles. By 1981, there was virtually nobody left to stand against him. But back in the south, another war was on the rise, and it too would change the political landscape. In March of 78, 11 Palestinians snuck into Israel and hijacked 2 buses full of civilians. Before they could be stopped, they'd murder 37 people and injure another 76. It was the provocation that Israel had been waiting for, and 4 days later they invaded Lebanon. In just a single week, thousands of civilians would be killed, with hundreds of thousands more displaced from their homes. Not just the Palestinians, but also the local Shia, who up until that point had little vested interest in the war. And so watching that tenuous Lebanese peace collapsing before their eyes, the UN would demand that Israel return across the border. And for now, they'd listen. but no longer allowed to send soldiers themselves. They'd support a local Christian paramilitary under the leadership of brutal Lebanese army defector Saad Haddad. Despite only having 5% of the region's population, his southern Lebanese army would gain enough power to turn him into one of the region's most dangerous warlords. He'd declare the South his own independent nation, and in turn be branded as a traitor by the authorities in Beirut. But they didn't control the South anyway. And the only thing his income was judged on was how much he could punish those Palestinians who did. So, for the next 4 years, Israel's main goal was trying to provoke the PLO into a response that would free their hands for yet another invasion. With America protecting them from any true reprisals, even as their southern Lebanese army shot 3 Irish members of the UN peacekeeping force, they'd only ever increase their pressure. If the international rules no longer allowed them to kill those who were plotting against them, then they would simply break those rules. And if those Palestinians ever took the bait, they'd invade and kill them. It wasn't exactly a winning position for the PLO. So in May of 1981, with growing Iraqi, Iranian, and Syrian attempts to destabilize their coalition, not to mention the Christian militias all uniting in Beirut, Arafat began looking for a way out of that trap. At talks in Saudi Arabia, he expressed his first real hints of a willingness to compromise, perhaps even find a two-state solution, which in and of itself implied a recognition of Israel. It was everything the Israelis had asked for, which of course is why they rejected it. Because this was the moment they'd been waiting for. He wouldn't be at the table if he wasn't weak, and so again they'd ramp up the pressure. In July, ostensibly in response to rocket attacks across the border, they'd commit a war crime and bomb residential Beirut, taking out an apartment building and indiscriminately killing over 300 people, most of them civilians. And again, a ceasefire would be hastily brokered by the UN. But in June of 1982, Iraqi-sponsored assassins under the command of Saddam Hussein would attempt to murder an Israeli diplomat in London. And again, it was the provocation that Tel Aviv had been waiting for. They downplayed reports of Iraqi involvement and blamed the PLO, responding with the cross-border killing of over 100 people. And when the Palestinians shot back, they called it a violation of the ceasefire and began a pre-planned ground invasion of Lebanon. Again, the UN would tell Israel to return home, but this time they were not willing to listen. And they weren't just going to stop in the south. Virtually every faction of Muslim Lebanon would rise to resist them. The Shia, Sunni, Palestinians, Druze, all walks of life, all political spectrums. It didn't matter how much they hated each other yesterday. They weren't about to let Israel decide tomorrow. But that said, militias can't just stop an army because they're angry enough, especially the Israeli army. Even with the Syrians fully committed against them, it was only a matter of days before their military had Beirut surrounded. And then for the next month, that army would relentlessly and methodically bomb what were, or what they perceived to be, PLO strongholds in the city. They'd never actually send in their soldiers. That was too dangerous. They'd just sit on the outskirts and bomb. Which, again, credit where credit is due. If the goal was rooting out the PLO, then that definitely achieved it. Already in a weakened position, this was like hell being brought down on their houses. It wasn't just their soldiers being killed, it was their people. Mothers, children, civilians, every day another entire apartment block destroyed because some intel claimed it was containing one of their offices. And under that hail of bombs, Arafat and his coalition would finally agree to leave Lebanon just so long as the Israelis left too. They'd even move their headquarters to Tunisia, thousands of kilometers away. But hey, why would they be at the table if they weren't weak? Israel had no interest in letting them escape, especially not now that they got them corralled. They'd already accepted the bad PR, and now it was time to do the murders, and they were going to do the murders. This wasn't a war, this was a war crime, and so virtually every voice worldwide demanded that Israel take the deal, including eventually the one that actually mattered. Under American decree, the Israelis agreed to the peace and they let the PLO leave the country. And to make sure that that went smoothly, America would even send an army. And just like that, Lebanon would change virtually overnight. The removal of those PLO would create a power vacuum not only in West Beirut, but all across the south of the country, where those local Shia had long since been subjugated to the whims of the Palestinians and those Israeli-sponsored Maronite gangs. So now with nearly 80% of the region's population, all they really needed to wrestle back control were some guns. And just as long as they understood who the real boss was, Assad was more than happy to provide those. After all, he was an Alawite, effectively Shia. And so they'd quickly turn into his most trusted proxy. By the early 1980s, they'd become the country's fastest growing militia, which meant that for the second time since the start of the war, the political landscape would see yet another total realignment. The East consolidating around the unification of Ismail's rifle, and the West falling into sectarian chaos. The third phase of the war had begun. With Vietnam now well in the rear view, on August 21st, 1982, an American-led multinational army was sent by Reagan to keep the peace. They weren't coming as invaders, they were invited, and their presence would provide yet another signal of increasing Maronite control. They presented themselves as neutral observers, but of course no Muslim questioned who America was there to help, and as their warships shelled the Druze on the outskirts of the city, it was clear that for all their promises, they were just another backer of those butchers in the Kateb. But now at their strongest point since the war began, those Maronites started to overplay their hand. On August 23rd, just 2 days after the arrival of their American allies, at perhaps the most sensitive moment in the nation's history, they elected President Bashir Ismail, anti-Syrian leader of the nation's most powerful fascist Christian militia, not to mention the one with the most atrocities to its name. This was a man who had killed hundreds of his own people, let alone his enemies. So it was likely no surprise to anyone that it was less than 3 weeks before he was murdered, even less surprising that it was Syria who pulled the trigger. Again, allegedly. But no doubt in expectation that someone would kill him, his Israeli allies were long since prepared to use this as a pretext. And claiming a need for security, they reinvaded West Beirut. Now removed of their PLO protection with nobody in control but the Israeli military, those right-wing militias were asked to descend on the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila to do what Tel Aviv couldn't. The IDF, under future Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, would launch flares and block the exits in the hopes of helping the Maronite slaughter. They'd listen to the murder of thousands of innocent people without so much as raising a finger. To that Kateb militia, now reeling from the death of their leader, this horrific massacre might not have exactly been justice, but it was something they'd been looking to do for quite some time. With Bashir in the ground, his more diplomatic brother Amin would be voted in next. And although, just like his brother, he'd align that Lebanese army with the interests of his militia, he'd be much more cautious about defying Syria when he did it. Especially now. Because across the Middle East, major regional changes were reshaping the geopolitical landscape. In 1979, an Iranian revolution would create a new nemesis for the United States, but in turn, a massive new ally for Syria. By 1982, they'd begin to export their revolution to disaffected Shia all over the Arab world, and in the 1980s, nowhere fit that description better than Lebanon. In the south, where both Israel and the PLO had for years treated Shiites as expendable others, there was no shortage of righteous anger to tap into. Every gang makes enemies. And so while Amal might have had the local protection racket covered, frankly, they didn't seem to care enough about Islam. And so sensing an opportunity in that, with the blessing of Syria, Iran secretly entered the country and began forming a hyper-religious Shia paramilitary. Their goal was nothing less than the complete removal of all Western influence. America, France, and most especially Israel. It was the beginning of what would eventually become known as Hezbollah. And as their entry onto that national scene, they would commit some of the era's most devastating attacks. In April of 1983, their suicide bombing of the U.S. Embassy would kill over 60 people, including the local head of the CIA. which frankly worked. It was enough to convince America that it was time to speed up their endgame, and a month later they'd force a peace treaty. The problem was, to get Israel on board, it had to be a full capitulation, and that was something that the Lebanese Muslims would never actually agree to. So, although the paper was technically signed by the Maronite president, it would be wrong to say it was ever actually real practice in the country. Even still, Israel and America would stick to that plan. Israeli strongholds would be given back to the Lebanese army, and other than their buffer in the south, the country would be handed over entirely to what was effectively the Kataeb militia in all but name. It was really kind of no different than if Bashir was still alive, except somehow Israel had also legally given themselves the right to more violence, which to a vast majority of the country was just unacceptable. And in turn, it would become the lightning rod that would restart this war. With this new cause to use as his center, that son Jumblat would set up a coalition to oppose this humiliating Israeli peace. Druze, Palestinians, and hell, even the Syrian army. And when the government forces came to Chuf to restore control, they'd find more resistance than they could overcome, and before long they'd be stalled and eventually even turned back. From their headquarters in West Beirut, sensing the army's weakness, the now powerful Amal would join the Druze rebellion, opening yet another front on an already overburdened war. In Tyre, they'd even bomb an Israeli headquarters, killing 46. But not to be outdone, in October of '83, the predecessors of Hezbollah would commit 2 more suicide bombings, killing nearly 300 soldiers of the multinational force. Over 250 Americans and 50 French soldiers would die in an instant. More Marines than had been killed on a single day since the Second World War. It was an act that would put their names on the map, both at home and abroad. It was a powerful moment in the rise of Islamic fundamentalism because those 2 bombs had done what thousands couldn't. America was tapping out. In February of '84, Jumblat's new coalition would push to the outskirts of Beirut and then, with the help of those Shia, successfully assault the city. The Lebanese army would collapse, and alongside them, the supposedly peacekeeping Americans who'd propped them up. By March, not a single Western soldier would remain in the country, and the checkpoints they'd leave behind would be filled by the Syrian-sponsored soldiers of Amal and Hezbollah. Yet again, for the 4th time, the country would see a major realignment. The final stage of the war had begun. In 1985, now with the most powerful militia in the nation, Amal would turn on their Palestinian allies. At the prompting of Damascus, they'd begin a campaign of eradication. If Syria couldn't control Palestinian interactions with Israel, then they were a threat that shouldn't exist. It was an act which helped not only their rise, but also kind of their fall. Because on the one hand, it did make them into the most powerful street gang in the country, but at the same time drove a wedge straight through their own hearts. Because not every Shia was willing to fight against Palestinians, even if they were Sunni, even if Syria said so. Every nation sings in 1,000 sirens, and Amal could only sing a few. So partly out of ideology and partly out of politics, as that Syrian proxy increased their attacks on Palestinians, Hezbollah stepped in to protect them. Syria and Iran, however, would remain allies. By 1988, and those 2 powerful Shia militias would be in open conflict in the streets of Beirut. Syria and Iran both preached calm, but both sides knew they'd back whoever won. They call it the Battle of the Brothers, and even though neither side would exit having gained all too much, I'd argue that Hezbollah was the clear winner, because even as Iranian Shia, every time they defended those Palestinians, their cause looked that much more legitimized in the eyes of the Arab world. But either way, at their core, they were both just Irano-Syrian proxies, and the lands that they now ruled were all but destroyed. Their government were puppets, and their army was broken. Even the Palestinians had been quieted down. By 1988, Damascus had clearly won. A lot more stones than they anticipated, but to be fair, it was also a lot more birds. And now, with their hands firmly on the national throat, they were going to oversee the final election of the war. And guess who was going to win? With their backs against the wall, those defeated Maronites would throw their final Hail Mary. In September of 88, with just a week left in office, President Ismail would fill the prime ministership with a general named Michel Aoun, a staunchly anti-Syrian Maronite. Never before had there been a Maronite prime minister. It would instantly break the government, but that was kind of the plan. From there, Aoun could puppet the remains of that Frankenstein state and hope people mistook it for a living being. But there was no possible way, even if he was telling the truth about Syria, which he was, granted. Nobody was going to listen to a Maronite who just broke the Constitution to say it. The only support he got came from George Bush and Saddam Hussein, and all they really wanted was someone who would hurt Iran. But Aoun was focused far closer to home, and in February of 89, he'd declare war on the Christian militias, considering them tainted by Syrian influence. Which, granted, they were, but what did it matter? It wasn't like he was actually going to stop them. He had about 30% of a crushed military. All he really ended up achieving was destroying major sections of what was an otherwise relatively untouched Christian enclave. A month later, and he would declare a farcical war of independence against Damascus. But outside of his tiny enclave, the vast majority of the country considered his government illegitimate and naturally went about electing their own parliament to represent them. Granted, it was a parliament that was almost entirely stacked with pro-Syrian voices, but they were legitimately elected voices. And in November, they would agree to a peace treaty that was sponsored by the Saudi-backed Lebanese billionaire Rafik Hariri. Aoun could deny it all he wanted, but the war was over. The Muslims would get equal representation in parliament, the presidency would be weakened, and congressional power would be increased. The militias would hand in their weapons, and they'd all return to a purely political stance. Well, all of them except Hezbollah. They'd be allowed to keep their guns, ostensibly as a means of continuing their struggle against Israel, but more likely due to their position as the primary Syrian proxy. But while the peace might have not been perfect, at least the war was over. With the treaty signed, Lebanon set about voting itself a new president, a vision of unity named René Mawad. He was a leftist Maronite pluralist, proposed as the most likely candidate to be able to bridge the many gaps that had opened in Lebanese society. It's just that as part of that unity, he refused to dismiss Michel Aoun. And so 17 days later, Damascus would have him killed. Again, allegedly. Not surprisingly, his successor wouldn't be so defiant. He'd fire him virtually immediately. But again, Aoun would deny the government's legitimacy and continue his symbolic last stand. It's just before long, his clock started blinking zero. The war was over. The time of the Maronites had ended. And in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. America declared war, and in exchange for supporting their invasion, they gave Syria the green light to remove him. 2 months later, and Aoun would be bombed into exile in France. With their opposition now in ashes, that new puppet president would sign over the country to Syria completely. It was a far more complete capitulation than the Israelis had ever demanded, but there was simply nobody left to fight it. By 1991, independent Lebanon was dead. But that said, can you ever really kill a Frankenstein? More on that next time. This is Rare Earth.